Yeah, I'm glad I was able to get a hold of you because I've been growing cactus now for about 4 years, and I feel like I've come across your name 7,000 times.
Yeah, that's
I'm a
probably true.
and then I'm always about to buy your book, the hard copy of it, and then I'm like, I can't do it yet. It's all. I always find it for like 100, $200. It's always
No,
like,
it's not.
really?
No, it's not. People sell that, but it's still in print.
Is it? I
I'm
can never
I'm
find
I'm
it.
happy to I'm happy to sell a copy of it to
Oh, I would love
anybody
that.
for 25 bucks plus
Wow.
postage.
Is it on your
And that
website?
uh no, I don't have any commercial links on the website.
Okay, that's what it
But if
was.
anybody contacts me, um, I'm more than happy to sell them a
Oh,
copy for
wow.
the
Okay.
same price
That's
it's
good to
always
know.
been.
Yeah, exactly. I thought it was like because a lot of times, a lot of those older books I'm into, they fetch a high price.
Oh yeah,
Like a lot of,
I don't know why that's the case, both with this and the tryptamine books. I've seen the San Pedro book selling for in excess of $300.
yeah, it's
I've
on
seen
eBay.
the tryptamine book selling for $600. And it baffles me because I'm happy to sell copies to
Oh, wow, it's
anybody.
good to know.
And the on the San Pedro book, the producer of it in South Florida still sells cases of the books to people for wholesale prices, including the people who are selling it for outrageously high prices. They're still buying it for exactly the same wholesale
Oh,
price
that's
they've
so
always bought
crazy.
it for.
I thought it was just like a rare out of print situation. I'm
Well,
glad I never bought it.
it's been listed as being out of print because of a snafu that happened when it went to print initially, and it didn't make it into books in print. And I think what had happened is the publisher did not submit physical copies of it to Bowkers after lodging an ISBN number.
Oh, okay.
That's my understanding of what happened anyway.
Oh, that's good to know. I'll definitely be reaching out for a copy then. Because I used to read it online, but I don't know if I'm just getting older, but I can't read online as much anymore. My eyes start to kind of
Yeah,
go
well, I mean,
both ways.
yeah, you can download PDF copies to your computer, but it's the same thing. Looking
Yeah.
at a screen rather than reading a
I
book
just love
is,
having a hard copy because then I can go and do it and read it somewhere else, or just
yeah,
take it with me. So I'll
me
definitely
too.
be reaching out.
Plus, I can flip back in the pages or
Yep.
forward, and it's just a lot easier to physically work with a book than an
Yeah,
electronic copy.
that's true.
And I know
The,
some people would argue that, but that's not me.
it's not me. I need a book. I need to go be able to like hide from my wife and kids and go read it for a couple hours and then come back out and then reference it or leave it out with like just leave it where it's ready to be looked at. But no, the other reason I reached out to you is when I've been kind of just researching different psychoactive drugs now for about like intentionally for about 4 years now.
Mhm.
And I've been getting this past summer and into the fall, I've gotten really into Shogun's Magical Six, which kind of
Mhm.
started from the cactus, got me into 2CB, then 2CE. And then I was like, oh, now I want to check out the other three, which are almost impossible to find in my world. So I
Well, right,
finally,
right.
what's that?
I said, yeah, right. This is true,
They're
especially
very rare.
DOM.
DOM is very rare. And I finally came across a reference sample of it. And I started researching it and looking into it. And I'd always heard of DOM and STP from like the point of view of like, I always thought of it as kind of like the bath salt of the 60s, where like it came out and it was like media frenzy and everyone just immediately was like, don't ever touch that. It's like a 3 day affair. It's
Well,
just absolute
that
bananas.
is what happened, but there's no evidence it's actually a 3-day affair.
That's when I read your
But
paper.
it
I was fascinated.
but Smith and Myers, two doctors associated with the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, were adamant about trying to scare the public. And so they used a lot of hyperbole to scare people away from it quite deliberately. And it really was a disservice because it caused it caused some problems in terms of leaving this lasting fiction around it. Because depending on who you read, anywhere from a third of the people to two-thirds of the people who tried it didn't like it. Um, but that also means between a third and two-thirds, depending on who you listen to, between a third and two-thirds of the people who tried it really did like it and found value in it.
Well,
Um,
what
but
happened
that's
though?
yeah.
It just kind of like came out. I mean, you weren't around back then, I'd assume, right?
I was, but I was a 10-year-old, so
Okay, yeah. I was
I had no involvement.
I would have been a negative 20-year-old.
But
So
it's one it basically when it when and how it came out was that things were ratcheting up here in the US as far as there was no scheduling at that point. Some drugs were illegal, many drugs weren't. Some were in a sort of limbo zone after some legal changes that happened in 65. But what that did is it painted the picture very clearly that LSD was going to become scheduled, which it did under emergency scheduling, I think in 67, maybe either 66, 67. But what had occurred is, Owsley had already made, over $1 million producing and selling LSD while it was legal. And both he and Nick Sand were concerned about, well, what do we do now? We're about to lose LSD as something that we can legally produce. And granted, they went on to produce it illegally after the fact. But at this point, they both approached Sasha and asked him, "Do you have any recommendations what we could do when LSD becomes scheduled? Is there something else that we could be making that's actually legal?" Which was when he suggested DOM might be a molecule that they should evaluate. And so he provided them with, essentially the reaction sequence, which isn't a recipe. It just says the sequence of the reactions that could be used, and had been used by Sasha to make it. And of course, to turn it into something actionable, um, both Nick Sand and Tim Scully, at the direction of Owsley, set about to determine how to make it from Sasha's recipe card, or his reaction card. And that was how it came to be, was through those people independently making it. Tim succeeded first, and then Nick afterwards with Tim's help. But at that point, Nick took off making it. He made a lot of it. I forget exactly how many pounds he told me he had made, but it was something in the order of 20 or 30 pounds. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering an exact
still,
number,
that's a
but
lot.
well, especially when you consider the majority of it was distributed in three to 3.5 milligram doses. That's a lot of doses
Yeah.
to distribute. But at that level,
What were they
it's
doing
more
then?
of,
Press pills?
yeah, certain pressed pills, some capsules, but it was also distributed as bulk material, which meant other people repackaged it. But Nick was primarily tableting things. There's these tablets called magic pumpkin seeds that were floating around the U.S. back in the day before I tasted anything. Um, but that they were primarily being used as a mild stimulant because at a low dose, DOM feels like a sort of non-pushy speed.
Yeah, I
You know,
took
it feel
4 milligrams of it.
Yeah, and
And
so if it's subhallucinogenic, it's a euphoric stimulant rather
yeah.
than a psychedelic.
So it was funny. I like, because I told my wife it was usually once a month I'll test something.
Mhm.
And I like to give myself like 30 days in between. So it's like completely, I can like assess what it's doing. Because I feel like if I get them too close, then you're like, oh, this is half of what happened 2 weeks ago. So
Well, right. There's that, and then there's also, you know, in my belief, we gain something
yeah,
from the experience. And if a person packs them too close together, they run the risk of not adequately processing the previous experience.
yeah,
Because if you haven't had the time and the input to actually process it and bring back something that's yours
yeah,
after it's over, then it's essentially like watching cartoons or a movie or
yeah.
something. And when it's over, except for some memories.
So that's how, and I've like 2 weeks is, I think, what for the tolerance to break. But I've realized a month is when I stop seeing the effects in my day to day life. So if I have like a very powerful experience with like LSD, there's
Mm.
like a good 4 weeks where it's like coloring the rest of my actions and through my life, and then that starts to fade. So I feel like when I test these things, I like to give them that 30-day window to be like, I'm going to test this and then see what it does mechanically or whatever in
Yeah,
the day to day.
that's a great approach.
So with the 4 milligrams, it was funny because I'd read so much about it. And
Hmm.
like Arrowwood's kind of a tough source for DOM because you can't really, a lot of it will be like 5 milligrams followed by 2 milligrams followed by nitrous
Yeah,
oxide. Like I
right,
don't, it's
right.
like, and then you read it'll be like, my stepdad was away for 2 hours, so I took DOI, and you're like, what? And it's like, but it might have been DOB, but I think it was DOA. I'm like, okay, I can't get this.
Yeah, it's hard to parse much from that.
But yeah, I took 4 milligrams and I was like buckled in. I brought myself a bunch of logs in to feed my wood stove all night. And then when it finally kicked in, I was like, oh, this is just pleasant. Like, I'm just like, I feel like I had like a very magical cup of coffee and I'm
Yeah,
clear headed. And I was like, this isn't anything to like, this was very, it was very gentle, but I was kind of glad, like, oh, this is cool. This is like a, something I could probably work with in the future. So next I'm going to go up to like maybe 5 or 6.
yeah. For most people, somewhere is between 5.5 and 6.5 is a decided inflection point where it becomes psychedelic.
And it becomes psychedelic, would you say, like, is it still that kind of clear-headed pleasant psychedelic, or does it get like,
It is, but something I had found in my limited evaluations of it was especially once you're several hours into the event, um, there's some difficulty thinking purposefully, some foggy headedness, and it doesn't continue to preserve the clarity, say, like a mescaline experience would.
hmm,
And I think that it might be a function of the metabolites forming because there's, up to two metabolites that can form out of DOM that are also psychoactive. And some people have proposed that they might contribute to the long-lasting action of it.
oh, so
But
they
this
kind of
isn't
come in secondary?
right, right, because they're metabolized and by the liver, and if they don't leave your bloodstream, then you've got a second and a third active molecule in your blood.
So you're saying it gives you at the more like 5 to 6 milligram range, kind of like that mescaline clarity and that
Well,
analytical thinking.
initially, but what I also found is as a few hours into the peak, um, there is more of a state of fogginess and confusion and a loss of that clarity. There's a point in the head where clarity is persists, but when a person tries to purposefully think through things, it's not nearly as fluid as it would be, say, with mescaline, which in my experience leaves a person with a very clear mind, almost sober in the very
Yeah.
heart of things. And I think that's one of the reasons why mescaline is so appreciated for people who are using it, as like a psycho-spiritually dynamic tool to work with, or
It,
people who are actually using it in bona fide religious activities like Native American church,
yeah.
even though they're not actually basing their religious activities around mescaline. It's being based around peyote, which is, despite how a lot of people think of it, it's not a mescaline experience. It's a drug interaction involving mescaline and at least four other alkaloids that are present in physiologically active amounts. And so, peyote experience tends to be much more robust than a simple mescaline experience.
Hmm.
And I think many people prefer mescaline for that reason.
Is it more of like that full body? Like with the mescaline, I got a lot of like, I got like extreme clarity, but it was this like body load that I wouldn't say was pleasant, but definitely went hand in hand with the clarity of the mindset.
Yeah, and the other alkaloids contribute more of a body load to it also, but like peyote is soporific. And so it adds a little sleepiness isn't the right word for it, but it adds this contribution of a soporific along with the mescaline. And then you've got lafoferine, and it's not clear exactly what it does on its own because it's an unpleasant drug uh, that most people don't like. Like when Hefter took it, he had a headache and felt feverish from it, but which aren't really things that are contributing to what people are looking for. But when you're
Yeah.
taking peyote, you're getting all of these together at the same time. I mean, there's like, I think 60 some alkaloids that have been found in peyote, but most of them are not present in physiologically active amounts.
And then what do you think about San Pedro tea versus extracted mescaline?
Well, it depends on the San Pedro, because there too with Trichocereus, you don't have just one thing. You have some of them have predominantly mescaline, but some of them also have 3-methoxytyramine. Some of them have DMPEA, and both of those can compete for the same receptor sites that mescaline occupies, which can result in a sort of buffered version of the experience compared to peyote.
That makes
But there
sense.
too, with the different trichoseriasis, there's a wide range of chemo profiles across the species or even within some species, like with Trichoserius peruvianus. Some genuine Trichoserius peruvianus have been found, and this is true with Pachanoi also, that contain no mescaline at all, even in adult ones. And so there's this range literally from zero point 0.0 up to some percent. And so it's easy for people to draw bad conclusions if they try to force fit everything together based on the pronouncements of a botanist saying it's one
Yeah.
species. And so knowing what strains you grow is actually just as important as knowing what species you're growing.
And then how do you test all the alkaloids? Like, how do you get all the content of what's in there? Like, I understand the mescaline concept, but like, how do you take a cactus and then be able to judge all the alkaloids that are in that cactus?
Well, how most people would approach it analytically is they would do a simple extract with some solvent like methanol that would recover everything that's there, or almost everything that's there. Um, some of the quaternary compounds won't come over, but they're also trivial. And then you'd take that mix, which basically has all of these different alkaloids, and you'd use some technique like GCMS, which basically it's a like chromatography using ionized products of the molecules that are present, and then it gives a spectra based on molecular weights of the molecules and known fragments that come from them when they're broken apart to run through the gas chromatography. And then the mass spectrograph will tell you what the molecular weights of these fragments and molecules are. And so that's how people look at the individual pieces. Sometimes there's things that are close enough you can't tell them apart using a mass, GCMS or one of the other mass spec approaches. And so in that case, people will use, and you could also use HPLC, high pressure liquid chromatography, for doing a similar thing, but there you're looking at retention times in terms of how long they take to come out. But to tell them apart, in many cases, you need additional techniques like, infrared or NMR to get positive identities. But that's the usual approach that people would take, would be starting with, something like GCMS or HPLC. And then the points where they had questions that use additional analytical techniques to assign a proper identity.
Damn. Yeah, it's way more beyond my scope.
Well, it's
Uh,
beyond most of us. It's not something that we can do in our kitchens.
yeah. See, I started
But
growing like 4 years ago, and like I don't have a plan. I just got a greenhouse. Thank God, I got a free greenhouse from my cousin. So I've just been like focused on mostly growing. And then I worked with a little bit of like simple extraction, and I've also brewed some tea. But like I'm still at the phase where like you're saying of like knowing what you're growing, where eventually I want to be able to be like, I've tested that one, but I guess I would just be testing for mescaline content in my simple setup. So I would love to be able to
well,
say like which ones are.
essentially, but you're also in the ones that you're doing where you're coming back with a mixture, what you're evaluating is a mixture.
Yeah.
And so you're comparing blends and mixtures. It's not it's probably relatively rare that mescaline is the only thing present, although that could be the case in some of the cacti like the Trichocereus burgessii. Some of those look to have very few, sometimes no other alkaloids that are showing up in analysis. But this is an area where good analysis hasn't been performed in some years in terms of a broad-based analysis. I know there's one project that's underway right now, but I don't believe it's past the point of the worker amassing the samples to be run. There's lots of people looking at analysis of the mescaline content of various cacti, but the problem is there's no rigor that's being included in this. So it can be misleading comparing things side by side. Like, say, if one sample had seen drought stress for a year before
Yeah.
that, and another one had been really lush, or one was new growth and one was older growth. These pieces of the data aren't necessarily being included. So when people put their results all side by side, um, it's tempting to compare them, but it's not always legitimate
Yeah.
to
I
say
also
that they're comparable.
I worry too a lot about just knowing myself how much mislabeling of clones and whatnot is out there.
Well, there's that problem too, which is a huge one. Like there's
Like I mix up
something.
two
Yeah,
a week, and I usually
yeah,
just pull the once I don't know it, I just pull it, and it's a no ID. I'm like, I
yeah.
don't.
Plus, there's this weirdness that can happen. Like there's something kicking around as the lumberjack clone.
Yeah,
Now, the person who claims that they had done this originally, that it was just a joke that took off, and they've got a story where it was called the lumberjackus. And well, I remember no talk of the lumberjackus around that time. I got a specimen from somebody who claimed to be the person who got it from a some sort of a California lumberjack hardware store. And it looks sort of distinctive, like it's sort of an intermediate between, Peruvianus and Burgessia. But I know other people who've gotten supposedly the same thing, supposedly from the same person, and it's clearly just a standard old Burgessia. And
yeah,
so I can't untangle that. And so I prefer not to even try because there's too much noise. And if we respect noise and try to create good data out of it, we run the risk of creating what appears to be data out of bullshit.
yeah.
And it's a lot better to try to just stay really narrowly honest about what we know and what we don't know, rather than creating more mythology.
And then, do you still
And
grow a lot of cactus yourself now?
I grow a fair number. I'm living in coastal California, which isn't the best place for growing cactus, at least not in the redwoods.
Why it's too
Yeah,
gets too cold, or I guess you don't get much
well,
sun.
it's it's not so much it gets too cold, but that there's too much shade from all of the redwoods.
Yeah,
And so I get these narrow bands of light. If I was still like living in Oakland, for example, they would be thriving there. And instead of getting, a couple of inches of growth per column per year, I'd be getting up to a couple of feet.
yeah,
And so that would be a much better climate. But I still grow plants because I collect them and I, trade them and give them away to people and try to get other people propagating them. So I'm always going to be growing plants, but not like when I was in Texas and still had lots
yeah.
of space for doing so.
And what did you get started with?
My
Peyotes?
very No, my very first psychoactive cactus that I bought was San Pedro cuttings that I ordered from a company that was then in Louisiana named Swamp Fox. And I don't know if they're still around or not. I really doubt they are. But that was I think I was 15 when that happened. But that was my very first ones
And
that
that's what
I
got
got a
you into
hold
all
of.
this, or
Well, I mean, I've always been interested in cactus, but
yeah,
not so much as a grower. My first exposure to cactus was with some tiny ball jointed opuntias. were these little barbed spines, barn, barbed spine balls. And I was walking in a grassy area in northwestern Nebraska at a place called Marsland. And all of a sudden, yeah, I felt pain on my ankle. And I looked down and there's this thing like embedded in my ankle, sticking out to one side. So I reach down and I pull it off, being completely unfamiliar with cacti. I reach down and pull it off, and then I realize it's now stuck to my finger. And I try to get it off, and it's now stuck to another finger, and then two fingers. And that got me really interested in cacti because it was so intensely tenacious. It's like it did not want to leave me. I had to like pry it off of myself with a small stick to finally get it off. But that just really left me impressed with the effectiveness of cacti, of that mechanism of distribution
Yeah.
by just sort of sticking to a passing by animal and getting dropped off some way along the path randomly.
Yeah. That's
That's
funny.
that's just a a beautiful piece of engineering.
Oh yeah. And that's what I love about growing them is like I tried growing cannabis plants for a while, but they need so much love and care. And then the
Yep.
cactus are kind of like they can take as much love and care as you want to give them, but then if you want to leave somewhere for 2 weeks, they're fine. And then you
Oh,
come back
right.
to them again, and like it's so they can take as much attention as I want to give to them. But then it's not like I have to be there every day watering them. It's not like one day without water is going to kill them if it goes above 100. Like so they're very hardy, and they're just something about walking amongst them every day. You're like noticing the little differences on which one's pupping, which one's
Yep.
doing this. It's fascinating, and
It
I
is.
can't seem to get enough of them.
Well, that's the nice thing about cactus. They don't necessarily have to take up a lot of space, and
No,
they're infinitely rewarding, whether it's for flowers, watching new growth, just, looking at how they do over time. They're really magical plants.
or
But hey,
even repotting them.
could I back up to something you alluded to earlier about
What's
the
that?
scare tactics that were being used against DOM?
Yeah,
A really positive thing came out of all of that Matt Baggett drew to my attention, and it's sort of I find it fascinating.
he had a great paper too. I
Oh yeah,
read that one
I love
first.
that paper.
Yeah,
But what it is was that one of the things that had occurred was that Myers mistook what he was seeing when the first people came in. We still don't understand exactly what happened. It could actually be that the person really hadn't taken DOM and had taken some sort of anticholinergic agent, which is what Smith thought it was. But when it was combined with chlorpromazine or thorazine, it caused a profound respiratory depression, I believe. And they had to engage in some resuscitation and became convinced that this was a dangerous combination. Now, the significance of this was that was the go-to if somebody came in having a bad time with an LSD experience, they would give them thorazine. It would just sort of calm the person down, more for the people around them than the person,
yeah.
but the person would calm down. Now, so they were left in this dilemma of not knowing of some antidote that was appropriate to give for at people that were panicking from high dose STP. Because there was this idea that it was going to be dangerous, possibly even lethal to them. Now, that was where something super positive came out of this, because it forced the medical professionals to look at how the psychedelic community preferred to deal with this, which was don't shut it down. Because if you, the belief was that if you shut down that person's trauma that they were experiencing during that crisis, it would leave them with lingering trauma
Hmm.
that they would then later have to somehow find their way back to and address and deal with. So instead, they would sit with people and just try to give them a friendly, supportive, quiet space for recovery. And this actually became the predominant approach to psychedelic crisis care. That if a person absolutely needed some sort of tranquilizer or benzo, a medical professional could give it to them. But the preferred approach wasn't a drug approach. It was a what's referred to as a talk down approach or a
Yeah.
supportive approach. And that's that is how and where that approach came to predominate in the medical community rather than just the psychedelic community was because of this mistaken notion around STP not having an antidote.
Oh,
And
wow.
so that little error proved to be a really positive thing for countless people in the years that followed.
And they still do that to this day. They work on talk downs.
Most people do. And what you'll find is the more experienced people are, the more they're going to go to that route.
Yeah.
And the drug approaches will tend to be the go-to of people who are sort of panicked and don't really know
Yeah, I
what
don't
to
know what to
do.
do.
I mean, a friend of mine who is a psychiatrist made a wonderful parallel observation about psychiatrists, saying that you can tell how competent somebody is by looking at one of their psychiatric patients and examining how many different drugs they're taking. Because the less competent the doctor, the more drugs their patients are going to be
Yeah.
on. Because the doctor's throwing stuff at them, not really knowing what to do and hoping
Yeah.
something's going to work. Whereas a competent doctor will try to use drugs that work on somebody, and if they're not working, they'll get people off of that drug.
Hmm.
And the ones that they do use, they use at the lowest dosage possible. And so this is I think you'll find something similar in like emergency medical responders, where if the person has a skill set, they're going to seek for non-drug intervention.
Yeah.
Whereas if they're come operating from a point of fear, some sort of drug or a benzo to shut it down is going to be their first line of approach.
So also back to what you were saying about like the foggy headedness. Why do you think it was in Shulgin's magical half dozen?
That's
Like,
a
does
really
it?
good question. Well,
That's kind of what I'm
Sasha
trying to figure out.
Sasha mainly took it at low dose
Hmm.
during his history. He did over the years experience it up to 14 milligrams, which is, a rather strong dose. My personal suspicion is that there's a lot of reasons Sasha could have liked DOM, but my personal suspicion is he liked what it did to his orgasm because that was a big point of
I
interest for
came
both
that in the
Anne,
book.
Anne
Yeah.
and Sasha was,
The
how do these
erotic.
drugs affect our erotic experiences?
Yeah.
How does it affect the character of orgasm? How does it affect tactile input and sensuality? And so I suspect I'd have to obviously
You'd
ask
have
Anne
to
and
research.
Sasha to get a positive answer, which isn't possible at this point. But that's my suspicion
That's a
was
good.
that was just that there was something about the character of what it did for their lovemaking or
Yeah.
their orgasmic potential that is what he found fascinating about it.
Oh, that's tough. That's because my problem with that is like my wife is very supportive, but if I tell her I'm going to do one of my experiments, she usually takes it as a time to like go do her thing. So if I'm like, I'm going to take 6 milligrams of DOM and then I'm going to come in and have sex with you, she's like, nah, you're not doing both. Like it's one or the other. Like either go out by
Well,
the campfire and take your DOM and leave me be, or,
well, it might just be time for a
might take time.
little more talking because this is something that there there's precious few ways to actually explore that area and get answers.
Yeah. Because 2CB, I can stamp, I agree with the Shulgins on that one. That 2CB is a very so I worked my way through 2CB and 2CE. 2CE I was only able to take a very small dose because I only had a tiny bit of it. But I immediately it was like I could see why this is on your list. It's a
Yeah.
fascinating compound. Mescaline, 100%. I was like, this could be the top of the list. But then the rest of them I'm working my way through. And then my other question about DOM is since you said like there was 2/3 of people that liked it, what like has it
Well,
I haven't come across anyone who's tried it.
the
So it's
problem
like,
is it hasn't been around. It's very rarely been encountered since around 1973. And so most of the people who have experience have gotten older and
mhm,
died.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's just not a molecule that's been available for all of those years. What is that? It's like 50 years now.
Yeah, it's
It's
been.
been almost unavailable. And that's why most people, even if they have opinions about it, haven't actually tasted it.
And then was there back in, like you said, in 73, was it like a thriving thing that people were interested in for a while? Or was it just
Well,
always so?
now, this is where it gets really chaotic in terms of trying to come up with a simple answer. Some people knew what they had, but really rapidly, probably by 1970, maybe even by 1969, most of the DOM that was being sold as other materials. Like
Yeah.
the magic pumpkin seeds were quite often distributed as synthetic psilocybin. Sometimes they were sold as mescaline, but rarely was after that first year or two,
Yeah.
rarely did was STP sold as STP.
Okay, that
It
makes
was sold
sense.
as something else, or it would appear in things like Owsley's wedges, where it was like a milligram or less of STP combined with 250 mics of acid, tableted together.
Yeah.
And those caused some people challenges because of their duration lasting, several hours longer than acid. Um, but usually, when people got a hold of STP that was actually STP, they also knew their dosage.
Yeah.
And that's a really helpful thing, especially if somebody's wanting a stimulant dose rather than a psychedelic dose. And And I think that's what caught most people off guard with, STP causing problems initially, would be because it had a sort of a slower onset and then a slower time to ramp up afterwards.
Hmm.
And so there'd be people, including, Owsley on his first time, where he ended up taking 3 doses of it, his
Yeah.
very first time in.
So
And
what,
he'd,
three 10 milligram doses?
no, that was 330s. And so, he described it to me as being the worst 3 days of hell he had ever experienced. And this is where it gets fascinating to me. Obviously, I've never tried, a dose that big to know does it really last 3 days. But in no controlled study, um, does anybody report durations longer than between, 14 to sometimes 24 hours. And usually with the 24 hours, the last 10 hours of it is at a really light level. And so there's this peculiarity that we don't have answers for about why are these long durations being reported, especially during the first, couple of years that these things were around. Was it simply that there was higher dosages being used by people either taking too much at once or taking several in a row? Or was there more molecules floating around on the streets, such as was the suspicion at the time? One of the suspicions voiced was that there is these anticholinergics that had been stolen from some military project. And we do know that, Sasha believed BZ itself had reached the streets at some point around 67 or 68. And we know for sure that, molecules like ditran, which was also known as JB 336 and JB 314, had also reached the streets within just, because they were being found along with, I think it was 5 or 6 other related molecules by the BNDD as early as January of 1968. And most of these didn't have reference standards, where if the police were to encounter them, they would not only have no idea what it was, but their labs wouldn't have any way of identifying them.
And that
They
just
had
all fell under the umbrella of STP, you think?
there's a lot of suspicions voiced at the time that there was up to a handful of different molecules being distributed as STP. And unfortunately, this is something that we can't resolve because there wasn't the ability to analyze those.
Hmm.
Even though this was the same time frame when BNDD was getting a mass spec, nobody was actually familiar with using it.
What's
And how
BNDD?
the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs,
So it's the
that
pre-DEA pretty much?
that was, yeah, two steps before DEA.
Okay.
Then they got renamed and reorganized. Then they got dissolved and turned into DEA in 1973.
So
But
that's
when
fascinating.
but they were primarily using what's called microchemical techniques for drug testing, not with cannabis. With cannabis, they were still giving it to beagles and watching the beagles for signs of intoxication. And that might sound silly, but this was the standard test for cannabis for many years. That was, considered conclusive. Was you give it to a beagle and see if the beagle looks stoned. Um, and you see some of the pictures of this being done. It's
That's
very
funny.
clear that's an effective assay
Yeah.
because stoned dogs look stoned,
Yeah. Why
and so,
beagles?
um, probably because they're easy to handle and they're
Yeah.
relatively small. But I just don't know. But the microchemical tests where you use like a microscope and you add various reagents to your molecule, and then you see what crystal formations form. And then there's these like compendiums of these different types of crystal formations that you would then compare it to and do like a series of different reagents and look at the different crystal forms and then compare them to your books. This was how drugs were identified prior to mass spec coming on, online. And it does work, but it also requires a skilled operator,
Hmm.
as opposed, whereas anybody can shoot a sample into a mass spec, and anybody can run thin layer chromatography. So it opened it up where the lab techs actually could have better proficiency than the people earlier because they didn't have to have the same level of training.
So you think this, you say you're talking like late 60s, this is all happening.
Late
So
60s
all
is
these other
when everything
compounds are
was,
out there and no one knew
yeah,
what they were.
1967 in particular is when this was the case. Then 68, everything started changing because, BNDD was in full awareness. They needed to know what all of these things were. So there was more emphasis on their people getting trained for better instrumentation rather than simple reliance. They didn't abandon microchemical testing, but they brought new techniques into the mix. Like infrared, for example,
Hmm.
and ultraviolet, spectra, and all of which really helped them better identify molecules. But this was the era when all of that was happening.
And then since like after that, it just kind of was like nowhere to be found up until like more recently, or
Well,
has it always kind of been like,
there's some there's some complications here, and it largely involves, I would suggest, um, two things. One is public perception, because if nobody wants
yeah, no
STP
one's gonna
because
make?
they're scared of it,
Yeah,
and no people aren't really going to want to go out and invest the time, money, and risk in making it. There is
yeah,
also the issue of Nick Sand, who is probably the world's biggest producer of STP by far. He probably produced more STP than every other producer in the world put together. Um, Once he got busted for Orange Sunshine and then fled and became a fugitive, he was no longer pumping out the same quantity that was then being distributed through Hell's Angels. And so I think that loss of that one producer made a huge difference too, because newer producers and other producers didn't have interest in making a
yeah.
molecule that
It wasn't
everybody
being
was
called
afraid
for.
of.
That's true.
Whereas, Nick had found, that it was liked as a stimulant in low amounts. And that was one of his motivations for continuing to make it, even after, Owsley had abandoned all interest in it, and after Tim Scully had lost all interest in it.
So do you think they lost interest because it wasn't marketable, or it wasn't that much to it?
Well, I believe that they lost interest because it did not do what they expected out of it, and
They wanted a new
and
acid.
they wanted it was not acid and
Yeah.
didn't give them the same return and didn't give other people the same return. And so I believe that was the primary reason they lost interest in it, was it just wasn't doing what they wanted it to.
Yeah.
And it's something sort of interesting about Sasha. A lot of people are under the impression that, things like MDMA or mescaline were his favorite molecules. But his favorite molecule obviously is cheap red wine.
Yeah. I remember reading
But
that as infidel.
his favorite psychedelic, his go-to, if he was to choose a molecule to take for himself, was always LSD.
Was it?
Is about 200 to 250 mics was his personal favorite as terms of psychedelics.
Wow. I never knew that. I always
Well,
figured it was like,
it's illegal. And so, what you'll find is Sasha
well,
talked
just through
about
his
things.
books, through like Pico and Tico, he doesn't talk much about LSD.
Well, no, that's because it's not the focus of the
Yeah.
work he was doing. Um, but it was, if you look at his personal logs and bioassay reports for himself, um, it was the one that runs through it most consistently.
That's fascinating because I've been trying all of these like magical half dozens, and my goal is to, because I haven't taken LSD in maybe a year now, is to go back to LSD and see if I can like unravel more of it now that I've had all of these other experiences. Because like with
Well, I,
LSD, I get so much out of it, but there's like I get these like repetitive storylines that come up that I can never figure out why they're coming up. It's the
well,
strangest thing.
if you can't process or do something with it, try to abort it, because this is one of the challenges with LSD is to get a lot out of it, a person actually has to learn how to use it, and they
Hmm.
have to learn to understand that there's some elements of it that aren't really useful, especially if you get into repetitive loops that aren't productive, especially if they're what's the word?
Self
Especially if they have
generating.
you beating yourself up.
Not even
If
beating
they're if
myself up.
they're
They're so remote from my everyday consciousness. Like, so if I take some LSD, I'll have these like insights into like how like, balance is, I like very profound insights I can take with me. Right. But then there's always a part of it that gets obsessed with like cursive writing or like gangster rap or stuff that I never think about, but they'll
well,
come
well,
up. And I'm
well,
like,
one
why
of
am
the
I thinking
things
about this?
one of the things acid does is it's a non-specific amplifier of thoughts. So whatever is in there is going to get amplified, and it'll go in these like it goes in these sort of loops, and it
Hmm.
gets like a little more intense each time around. And if those are productive and of value to you, great. They're a good thing to have. But if they're ever something that you find is just distractive and of no value, if you just throw out some other thought, your mind's going to grab that thought and run someplace with it instead.
Oh, that makes
And so
sense. So
so
just
that's
kind of
a
be like, no, not right now.
well,
Like,
if it has no value and it's
yeah.
distractive, try to get some other thought going in its place.
Because I read somewhere that it's like when you're taking LSD, your brain's contracting and expanding. So when it expands, that's when you get those like grand beneficial thoughts. And when it contracts, that's when your brain just starts throwing up like, here's a cartoon, here's like a goofy, like,
Yeah, it can give you a
I don't know.
wide spectrum of
Yeah.
results. But
And this
like
is like 200 to 250 is like right around there.
yeah, that's where most people find to be a valuable maximum.
Yeah.
For like social situations, a lot of people would opt for
100.
100. This might be you know, a terrible thing to say in a public interview, but I would suggest that if a person is suited for it and they're in the right context, um, a dose of, like 1,200 or 1,500 micrograms is something that is actually of huge benefit to many people.
You said
But I,
1200 to
but I
1500?
wouldn't I wouldn't recommend that to people who are easily challenged or who have problems with integration, because it's but yes,
So what, I mean, if you want to keep telling me about like what changes when you get up into that scope.
it's not a straight line linear relationship. It's a very different experience where it it always reminded me of, like that wonderful joke from Bill Hicks about psilocybin mushrooms being a squeegee for your mind, where it leaves a person very clear
Hmm.
internally. And well, like I say, it can, some people are easily challenged, and some people, should probably avoid dosages like
Yeah,
that. I think some people should avoid psychedelics altogether.
I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially if a person who has a propensity towards something like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or something similar, they can actually find their conditions worsened
Hmm.
by psychedelic use. And that's really something that they would benefit from not bringing into their life
Yeah.
experience. Or if a person is ruled by fear, or
Hmm.
they're afraid of themselves, especially, or afraid of the dark corners in their mind. Tripping is the last thing that they
Yeah,
should
it's the last
engage
thing
in.
they want to do. But like, so I've worked up to about maybe 300 micrograms, and that was interesting. But I usually find myself going back to like 250.
It's most productive for most people.
But yeah, I would love. I mean, I would definitely love to try it in those deeper realms. But like right now, I'm just working my way through this half dozen, and then like, what are your thoughts on 2CT2 and or 2CT7?
I've never tried 2CT7. 2CT2 seems to have no effects on me. And so the other one should be good. But
2CT7.
I seem to be in a category where, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's receptor problems or whatnot, uh, it it just hasn't done it for me. Whereas, and I don't have an answer for that, but I know I'm not alone.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's, when I first tried 2CB many years ago, I found it incredibly boring because it would do almost nothing to me. It was just this, almost like mildly MDMA like
Yeah,
boring experience. And
I
then
find it
some,
boring in a way, but if you take it knowing that it's going to be kind of a low tone psychedelic experience, it's very enjoyable.
but then somebody pointed out, well, why don't you try pushing your dosage level up to about 30 and then insufflate 10 on top of it.
Yeah, you
And
tried that,
that was fully effective for me.
and
And
it
then
was
over the
enjoyable.
year, it was enjoyable and very intensely colorful.
Wow.
But over the years, something that Sasha had noted in PCall proved to be true, which is now, if I was to take like 22 milligrams of 2CB, it would take me to the same place that it used to take more than 30 to get me to.
Because of the big
So
experience?
I'm assuming that it was because my body somehow adapted to it, and that
Hmm.
there was some blockage in there that was preventing me from fully having a 2CB experience. But once I had had it enough times, that blockage was no longer in place.
So you can get there now in 22.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
yeah, very, very much so. I
And then what do you
suspect if at 35, it'd be a complete meltdown for me now.
have you ever gotten into like the scary land that Shulgin talks about?
I've been in some very scary places
Like I
with
remember saying on
phenethylamines.
2C or on 2CB specifically, I remember him saying like over I think 35 it was horrifying.
It I have done way too much 2CB before, and it is horrifying. It's like being turned into an industrial level hallucination generation engine, where it just left me hanging on for dear life and just sort of trying to surrender to the process and flow with it, but also immensely glad to see it end.
Yeah.
But that's true of all sorts of things, like, a too large of a dose of mushrooms is very similar.
Yeah, I get that with
As
mushrooms. But with mushrooms, I sit down knowing I'm getting that right off the bat. Because I've had a similar thing with mushrooms where like I've done like some like 5+ gram trips, and now like a 2 gram trip, I'm right back there. Like I'm on the ground. Like I don't know how people do them socially ever.
Yeah, I don't find mushrooms a sociable drug, but
And I also
t
like I find myself avoiding them often. Like if I
I
have a
u-
night, I'm like not mushrooms tonight. Like we're
yeah,
not
I
gonna.
usually avoid mushrooms just because as of, many years ago, I just started finding myself to essentially be the butt of a joke that they had.
I'm like that
And
with
I
tryptamines in general.
and I would just end up feeling beat up after the experience. And that's not what I'm seeking is a feeling of being, psychologically or emotionally beat up.
Just picked on all night. Yeah, I get with mushrooms specifically, and even DMT, I get this like teasing feeling where like something's teasing me as if I was in a schoolyard. Like
Yeah,
little kids are like poking me and like, you
yeah,
know,
I've had that with both of those, although I've gotten more of value out of DMT over the years. Although I can't go near it, for quite some time just because I believe it's too hard on my lungs.
yeah, I have a real hard. I can smoke it if I make it into changa, but I can't smoke it by itself. It's
Yeah,
like,
it's not good for our lungs to smoke any strong base.
yeah,
It actually causes lung tissue damage, and tryptamines specifically help cause lung tissue damage.
oh wow.
I mean, it's just everything should be in balance.
I try to avoid smoking in general. A little bit of weed, but like other than that, I'm not a big fan of like the onset of smoke drugs.
Well, yeah, especially basis, because like I say, it's you're essentially putting a caustic material into a moist environment
Yeah,
where the only thing that's going to result is localized tissue damage. And you're going to get effects from it, certainly, but you're also physically harming yourself,
yeah.
in a mechanical way, from this strongly caustic material being put into mucous membranes inside your lungs.
So then what's your favorite thing to use these days?
Oh gosh, it's something I hardly have time for
Yeah.
anything anymore, just
That's what I hear
because
a lot of people
there's
say where like,
there's too much happening all of the time.
yeah,
I'm also really overwhelmed in life right now because, I work for Arrowwood. I do work for Transform Press. I do work for myself also. I've just shut down a edible mushroom growing business with hopes of setting it up in another place. But then I'm also a board member on the Cactus Conservation Institute. I'm a board member for the Chihuahuan Desert Preservation Association. I'm a board member for the Shulgin Farm. And that doesn't leave a lot of free
yeah,
time for, because the thing about using some sort of psychedelic. It's not simply about using the psychedelic. It's about finding the time and space to get prepared for having the
yeah.
experience. Then there's the time for recovery from it and integration, where I'd
Hmm.
really prefer not to have other things distracting me or occupying my mind.
I'm in a
And
good
so,
space for that. Not to cut you off, but I
yeah.
have a 4 year old and a 6 year old that I'm homeschooling
Mhm.
now. So integrating while working with a 4 year old is like it's
Yeah, that
so
sounds
easy to do. It's
that sounds
like
perfect.
it's perfect because you're able to get into the mind of like a 4 and a 6 year old and just let them lead you for 2 days. And you're like,
Very
all right,
nice, very nice.
this is what I needed to. And then you're able to like, it's funny, like I'll go to bed and my 6 year old son will be asking me questions and I'm like, oh, I have a perfect answer for that now. And like through me answering his, catastrophic questions of a 6 year old going to bed, I'm able to like integrate my mushroom trips or my whatever. I'm like, oh, I actually was just thinking about that. And like, it's
Yeah.
very helpful to like have those two as my main human outputs day to day.
Well, and I'm hopeful I'll get more time in my life.
Yeah.
It's just because as projects get wrapped up, I should get more time. Like, for
And you're
example,
digitizing all of Shulgin's stuff right now, right?
we've essentially gotten through, right now, we're doing cataloging of books and items in the office. So there'll be some things coming up in the books and or maybe even books themselves that we'll be digitizing.
Oh,
But
wow.
that's all. And then I believe Arrowwood still has some photographs that need digitization. But I believe that's all that's left to go. We've
And is this
already
going to be
got,
one big book or like a big website or?
well, no, it's too much information.
Yeah.
Then there's also a confounding factor in it, which is that, I forget how many documents this involves, but it's something like 50 some linear file feet of materials. And much of it includes like personal and private information that we need to respect and protect.
Hmm.
And so this will be going online at Arrowwood in terms of, the hosting of it, but there's going to be two separate archive projects. One is what we can do now, which will have some material redacted for protection of privacy and some items not even included because they're way too private. But 100, 200 years from now, these privacy concerns won't exist.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to be concerned, oh, my grandparents did drugs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and at that point, the full archive will be available.
Oh, wow. Like a
And
time
that's
capsule.
and that's where historians are going to find it a gold mine for reconstructing a better understanding of what was occurring during this period of, Sasha's research history. It's just, right now we're still too close in where there's people whose lives could be harmed
Yeah.
if we didn't have respect for that. Because
That's fascinating. And so
and
in
so
even
so
in
that's
50 years, it's going to be like a
yeah.
snapshot of like the peak of the drug war.
Well, and beyond that, because
Yeah.
of how, I mean, it was sort of peculiar. Sasha's first wife was um, rather conservative, very religious, but she was quite fascinated by the social aspects of the world of psychedelics. So she was trying to collect everything possible about the interface between society and the world of drugs. And of course, Sasha was, working in his own areas, but between them, they were collecting this mass amount of material, not just about the drugs, but about how they had intersected with human lives, how they'd intersected with societal concerns, how society had been threatened by them, and how they'd responded. And so all of this was sort of compiled and documented as rapidly as they could find it. And much of it takes the forms of looking at these subjects drug by drug, where there's like, oh, probably, I think, 3 folders about this fat on just methamphetamine. Then there'll
Wow.
be, other areas on just cocaine, others on heroin, fentanyl, other molecules. Then I think there's 60 some folders just on MDMA. And then, I think there's maybe 4 fat folders on DOM. But we have all these treatments from the point of view of one drug or one class of drugs, rather
Wow.
than, having that being the subset, it's actually the topic. And so we see these concerns and interests being reproduced over and over for each of the different sets of molecules, or sometimes for individual molecules. Plus because of his association with, forensic chemists, there's a considerable database of what law enforcement was publishing. Like the microgram series,
Hmm.
that was started by the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and then ended up where it is now, which is being published by DEA. And then there's things like, the clandestine laboratory investigative chemists series, which aren't available. They're not considered available just because, there's too much risk of, them being used for mischief.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating assemblage of literature just because it covers so many different subjects. Or another one that's in there is all of the work that Edgewood was doing around THC and THC analogs, which includes every paper that's been published in the literature on it, as well as a lot of declassified material about what Edgewood was doing with those molecules. And so it's going to be a tremendous resource,
Oh, that's so
once,
cool.
because what's happening though right now is metadata is being assigned,
Hmm.
because the concern was trying to get done with it while Anne was still alive and had her wits, which she had until the end. Because she knew a lot of these people and could answer a lot of questions we had. So the goal was to try to complete it while she was still present.
Yeah.
And the correct way to do it would have been a little different, which would have been as soon as an item was digitized, it would have had metadata and search terms assigned so that it was instantly became entered into a searchable
Hmm.
database. But we skipped that so that we could get done with the digitization, because the assigning metadata is a longer process than just scanning a document.
Oh, so now you're going back through and putting it all
So,
in?
so now it's not just me, but a team of people at Arrowwood are working on assigning metadata. The first pass metadata will be identifying things with privacy concerns so that they can be sequestered from the rest of it, because the rest of it can have metadata processed by anyone. Whereas, if there's privacy concerns, it has to be somebody who's impeccably trustworthy.
Hmm. And how many of
And
you are
so
working on this?
the last I heard, there is about 5 people who are working on the metadata part. And then there's additional people working on the cataloging of the books. And I sort of straddle in between them. And that I engage in both activities.
And then what goes on at the farm today?
Well, that's the $1 million
I mean,
question.
can you still tour it, or is it like?
Oh,
Because I met
that
someone
can
that.
be, yeah, that can be organized, but the we're trying to create the Shulgin Farm into being a resource for the psychedelic community as a gathering place, as a place people can rent for events, as a place where, we can continue to do things like, for example, create workshops
Hmm.
or lecture series. But part of
Wow.
this is in the air where we really don't know how best to achieve that, because what's not clear is what's the best purposes that the farm can serve for the psychedelics community. The goal is to have a 501c3 called the Shulgin Farm buy the farm from its current owners, which is the Ann's heirs.
Hmm.
They're still the owners right now. And so we're already, doing things, but this is the end goal, is to, see the kids basically get their inheritance
Hmm.
and move on wherever they're wanting to move on to.
And are
Uh,
any of them interested?
well, sure, Wendy's going to stay
Oh, wow.
interested for sure, for sure. Um, but this is just really, it's a nebulous area, because what everybody wants to achieve is trying to maintain some openness and flexibility in this picture, because none of us are wise enough to know all of the ways that it could serve the community and
Hmm.
what of those are going to be best fits. And so we're trying to encourage more, not we're trying to encourage people to get involved and be supporters and help buy the place, but we're also trying to encourage people to get involved and give ideas to volunteer, actually get involved with what we're creating. Because one of the things that we'll be doing soon is working on the garden there and trying to make the garden nicer and friendlier to visit, including, having name plaques on all of the substantial plants that are growing there, so
Yeah.
people know what they're looking at. So but this is something where, volunteers for the gardening committee
Oh,
are
I'd
definitely
love to
being
do it. I
welcomed.
live so
And they're,
far away, though.
well,
Maybe
just
visit.
keep put
Oh,
yeah,
that'd be
put
cool.
put the thoughts out there, and if you're in the area, just check in about, potentials for a visit, because
That's the
many
downside
times,
with the 4 and 6 year olds. I'm always in the same area, but they're getting
well,
like
it's
travel ready. So
well, and at some point they'll be travel worthy.
yeah,
But
right now
four
they're
and
like a
six,
2 hour car ride.
yeah, 4 and 6 are a handful for their
Yeah,
parents to
and
maintain
anyone
to
around them.
maintain.
So damn,
But
that's
when
cool,
we've had
man.
events there, it's been very family and kid friendly,
Yeah,
which has really been wonderful. They put together, like, a kid play area so
mhm.
that parents can enjoy themselves, and there'll be, like, the ability for their kids to be playing with other kids and
Yeah,
still be safe.
oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
And then how
because
long? My other question is, how long have you been doing everything you're doing? Pretty much forever.
well, not forever. I haven't been alive forever.
I mean, since as
Uh,
long as you can remember. I mean,
my I first got interested in the experience in 1972 as a 14-year-old. And I've been, just incredibly interested ever since then. I'm 67 now. So, whatever this, 53 years.
53 years. Yeah.
So a while.
So you
And
were
I
born in what,
met
1958?
57,
57. You're my mom's
towards
age
the
then.
October
All
57.
right. Cool. Cool.
And And I met Ann and Sasha in 1993 at a botanical preservation course seminar in Maui. And Sasha and Bob Wallace were both urging me to start writing. And so
Hmm.
that was actually how and when I began writing things. Because I've always had interests, but my interests were for me, not
Hmm.
for publication. And then the involvement with scanning at the farm, I think, began around 9 years ago, well, 8 years ago, last May, I believe, either April or May. So, 8.5 years ago is when the digitization project started.
But from like 14 till now, like you've just been like doing this kind of research, like,
Yeah, largely privately
yeah.
for
See,
my
that's where
own
I'm at now
interests.
is private
It
research.
was it was but it was, there was a point in 91 that was sort of an inflection point for me, where I'd been, my career was working as a jeweler, goldsmith, and stonecutter, lapidarist. And it
Hmm.
was something I really enjoyed. And, psychedelics were, my private interest rather than, what I was doing primarily. And I came down with encephalitis and got largely blinded in my left eye,
Whoa.
which meant I had, no depth perception for doing fine-tuned jewelry work anymore. And what that did was something really remarkable, which is it caused me to abandon hope. And while that might sound like something dark, it also is a very liberating
Hmm.
concept, because in abandoning that hope, it also gave me the courage to ask the question, what am I really interested in life? Where is my passion? What do I want to be doing with the rest of my life? And so that's when I turned to psychedelics in a way that wasn't so much focused around their use as it was around their study. And so I tried to just put together as much information as I could and learn as much as I could. And then, within another couple of years, I started writing about it.
That's so cool.
And but that was how it all began back in the 90s. And then, with some fortuitous encounterings of people, like meeting Johnny Appleseed and starting doing a thin layer chromatography of surveying just weedy plants for DMT content, or meeting John Hanna, who took over the Entheogen Review after Jim DeCorn decided to shut it down, and then helping John as a technical editor with the Entheogen Review for the next, I think, 9 years. Um, but all of those just sort of fell into place,
Yeah.
just very organically rather than being sought out.
Hmm.
But that's sort of how I came to be doing what I'm doing right now.
That's so
And
cool.
then fun things like when my first real book came out, it got released at the first Mind States in October of 97 to coincide with Arthur Hefter's first bioassay of pure mescaline. And among the people I met at that event um, was Martin Terry. And I had already met Blake Williams a few years earlier in Texas when I'd gotten, this might sound a little dark, but it's just, my sense of humor. Um, I got real fed up with the what I considered toxic information coming out of anti-exotics organizations
What's
who
that?
had this. It's where people believe if a plant's not native, it
Oh,
should be
okay.
destroyed because, only native plants belong in a specific place. And there's some truth in this, but it's also can lead a person quite far astray
Hmm.
because often if you see a plant behaving as a weed, what's actually occurring is that that plant is being selected for nature to fill a niche that's been created by humans removing some other plant or compromising the environment locally. And so what we're actually seeing is nature attempting to heal that deficit through use of a new plant that's come in, because that plant has the properties that are valued for that.
Hmm.
I mean, and star thistle is a really good example of this, where, if you have a if you have native prairie that's fenced, you don't find star thistle. You start running cows on that land, you find star thistle. And star thistle seems to be nature's response to trying to encourage cows not to be there.
Yeah.
And so I'd created this company called Weeds just as a joke, not as a real thing, but just as a joke. And what our guarantee was that every species we sold was guaranteed to be aggressive and invasive in the right context. Now, I only had one customer, and that was Blake Williams, who bought a clump of Arundo Donax from me and was so impressed that he decided to buy another one just to see if he'd get as good of a deal, which of course he did. But this got us talking about peyote.
Hmm.
And Blake was interested in becoming a peyote distributor so he could cultivate it. Then he learned, well, peyote distributors aren't permitted to cultivate. But we were still really concerned about the plight of peyote down in South Texas and what was happening with overharvesting. And then in 97, this is probably 94, 95 is when I met Blake. I think in 94. And then I met Martin in 97. Then Martin met Blake in 99 at a NAC meeting in South Texas. And the summers around then, we realized that all three of us knew each other and that we were all talking about the same things with each other around, how can we help the plight of peyote and see that it didn't get wiped out. And so that was how Cactus Conservation Institute came to be, is the three of us decided we needed to do something. And Blake was an attorney, I'm whatever you call me. And Martin was just completing his third PhD in molecular biology. And so we had the skill sets to actually engage in work, starting with identifying where there was no work that was actually needed for people who were policymakers to be able to understand, the concerns. So our first one was we began this long-term project looking at the regrowth of peyote after proper harvesting, in terms of how fast do they recover, how many crowns grew back, what's the rate of recovery, what's the incidence of outright death from harvesting. And amazingly, none of this work had ever been done before. You would think that some commercial crop that has, a couple million plants recovered from the wild would have some level of sustainability study attached
Yeah.
to it. But we were the first ones to actually do such a thing, and it was, we could not find a distributor who would allow us to accompany them. We later learned why. And it's because a lot of the harvesting that goes on is really disrespectful and harmful. Like, we in
Still to this day?
oh yeah, yeah. After year 8, we had our study site get poached by commercial harvesters. Of course, the distributors, or some of
Who
their employees.
who are they
Uh,
selling all this to? Like the black
na-
market?
no, no, there's no peyote on the black
That's what
market.
I'm
It
saying. Like,
goes it
where
goes
does
to
it all
Native
go?
American Church. It goes to the Native
Oh,
American Church, to the licensed distributors. Um,
but are they
but
going through it all? Like for what? With like ceremonies and whatnot?
yeah, 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 and they're consuming millions and millions of plants every year.
Oh wow.
And this is still ongoing, but the emphasis has moved because of Texas becoming compromised for accessibility. The move is now, well, Mexico has plenty of plants. Let's just
Hmm.
get them out of Mexico, as if somehow that's an appropriate thing for doing to, Mexican
And how does
peyote,
the
which,
church feel about it? Are they kind of turning a blind eye or?
well, yeah, well, they have no real option. Now,
Yeah.
there's a small portion is interested in cultivation with the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, but there's still a lot of people that believe cultivation is wrong and cultivation, really should not occur at all.
From like a
Now,
sacramental,
well,
like,
yeah, it's this what I would refer to as magical thinking.
hmm
This idea that the peyote is such a powerful being, we should have faith that it can take care of itself.
yeah.
And I sort of believe that myself, but I believe that's how Martin and Blake and I got involved with it.
Hmm.
I haven't eaten peyote in many decades and won't. Even though I love it and respect it, I work for it.
Hmm.
But my belief is I was enlisted because I have things the peyote does not. I have eyes, I have a brain, I have a mouth, I have hands, and I have feet, all of which can be used for protecting the peyote's interests in ways
Yeah.
that the peyote cannot. Now, when our harvest site got poached, it really left us aware of why the distributors didn't want us following behind them. Namely, plants were being cut deep, sometimes all of the root coming up with them. Even small plants were harvested. And worse, it wasn't just, excessively brutal levels of harvesting. In order to not get stuck with thorny spines, the harvesters started by chopping out a lot of the black brush and removing the nurse plant protection, which are thorny plants, so they wouldn't get stuck, but also removing the shade that encourages peyote to flourish and creating a zone where peyote wasn't going to come back in those areas that had been denuded. And it was so extensive, you can like go on Google Earth and actually see the entrance area to our study site because of how much brush was removed from it. And so it's one of these problematic pictures where people are struggling to provide enough medicine for the people who need it,
Hmm.
but they're doing so in a way that's compromising their future. And the notion that it's now moved from this to let's just get the plants from Mexico because there's still more peyote in Mexico
Yeah.
is really problematic. It's probably many people would get offended if I was to refer to that as neo-colonialist thought, where,
Yeah.
people in the United States think it's okay for them to go to Mexico and take Mexican resources away from Mexican people without Mexican people saying, why don't you
Yeah. Why
come
don't you
here?
come
We'd
here and
like to
get them?
share this. Um, and so it's a very complex and problematic picture. But these are the things we were trying to um, educate people about with the work that we've written as part of Cactus Conservation Institute and the research work we're doing. Because we're not about religion, we're
Hmm.
not about psychedelics or the use of the plants, even though, we certainly support that occurring. Our interest is in simple biology and ecology and what's involved with peyote's long-term survival.
And how big
What,
is your test site now?
well, we can no longer go back to that same test site. The owners of it had decided that they're done with botanists, and they don't want botanists looking at their peyotes anymore. So we now have some other sites where we're doing populational density studies, where Anya Ermakova laid some transects out, and by that just means, like a nail at both ends of a run where plants are labeled with metal tags with stakes in the ground. And then we'll go back out there and locate all of the plants and measure them to see how much they've grown, and then record how many new seedlings have been recruited since the previous visit. So we're actually looking at, recruit a seedling recruitment along with simple survival. But we're not harvesting from these
Mhm.
sites. We're just looking at intact populations along these transects in several counties in Texas, and then comparing the numbers.
And this
But
is
that
what, like southern Texas bordering Mexico, or?
Well, South Texas bordering Mexico, and then we've got another site to compare it to in West Texas, and then one just as you come into the Trans-Pecos.
Oh, wow. That's all very fascinating.
Because we're just gathering data.
Yeah.
It's because in order for people to make good decisions, they have to have accurate information. And as a point of where this becomes problematic, if you read accounts about Native American church, you will see numbers of 225 or 250,000 members um, stated today. You can find new articles being written with those numbers included. That number has not changed since those two first appeared around 1959. And the NAC has grown substantially since then. Obviously, some members have gotten old and died, but
Hmm.
in their own internal survey of just a few years ago, they came out with 465,000 members, some of whom are saying that they eat peyote on average 55 times a year, with
Wow.
multiple plants per meeting.
And they
Now,
won't eat home cultivated ones.
many of them will not eat home cultivated ones. And
Wow.
part of that comes from, like I was saying, magical thinking that, if you believe the peyote should be cultivated, it shows you don't have adequate faith in the peyote's ability
Yeah.
to take care of itself. But if you wrap another layer on this that's easily overlooked, a lot of the NAC groups are actually fundamentalist Reformed group Protestants. And so these sorts of ideas come out very solidly
Yeah.
from fundamentalist thinking. And this is a artifact of the reservation system. When Ulysses Grant created the Board of Indian Commissioners, it was a 10-member board to govern over 10 reservations. And Grant was of the opinion this was necessary to prevent Native Americans from being obliterated, because there was a lot of people in the United States that would have been more than happy to see them exterminated
Hmm.
and gone. And so Grant's idea was that all of these Indian commissioners would be Quakers, because only the Quakers could really bring peace to all of the tribes. Now, the problem with this is, as soon as the other Protestant groups heard this, it was like, no, that's just unfair. They can't be Quakers. So all of these other groups each got their own reservation. But
Oh,
what that meant is each reservation, like one would be, like raised up as Methodists, and all the
yeah.
kids would be Methodists. Another would be Baptist, and one was Quaker. But in the first round, the anti-papist sentiment was so strong in the U.S., the Catholics got none.
Yeah.
Yeah, but by the next round, there was a Catholic reservation.
Oh, it's so
But
funny.
but basically, if you didn't comply with their rules, which had included outlawing of traditional language, outlawing of traditional, practices like use of the medicine man, dances, speaking of their language, and you didn't comply with this, you didn't get your rations. So here
Mm.
you're on this place under appalling conditions, and you're not getting food unless you're compliant.
Yeah.
You run that out over several generations of humans, and what you're going to find is a very high degree of conversion to whatever religion
Yeah.
it is that's
Whatever
running
needs to
that
get food.
picture. Yeah, food is a huge motivator.
Yeah.
Um, and so this has created this sort of, a artifact that's not adequately appreciated for where and how it came into being. His Grant was wanting to do something good, but unfortunately, once you do anything involving creating a bureaucracy, it's the bureaucrats who actually determine the shape of what
Yeah. It
happens.
usually doesn't pan out.
Not the person who thought up the idea.
Yeah. It's like when they
And so,
actually execute, it's not what they originally thought.
and most of the people involved viewed it as a way to convert
Yeah.
um, people into their religion. And part of that was taking away people's children and sending them to distant schools where they would grow up completely divorced from their culture. And it was, it was a very deliberate attempt at, cultural genocide.
Yeah.
Maybe not killing the individuals, but there's an attempt to kill who they were
Yeah. And
and
just kind
not
of
kill the
absorb them.
person, which is really dark and evil
Yeah.
on so many levels. And where it got almost perverse is when Collier became oh gosh, what's the word? The head of the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and was trying to put a stop to this. There is blowback from these missionaries who are saying that it was an illegal affront to their religious rights to say they could not take other people's children away from them and raise them as Christians.
This was all what, the late 1890s or something? Or like,
Is yeah, like 1890s and then
yeah,
into the first decades of the 1900s.
that's fucking crazy. It's not even that
Because
long ago.
no, and that's the thing is none of this was that long ago.
Yeah.
The it all started in the late 1880s as far as the codifications,
Did you
and
read
then
Mike J's book, Mescaline?
oh yeah, it's a
Yeah,
really
that
fun
got into a
book.
lot. That's it. I talked to him. So I've talked to three people so far. He's one of them. You're the other one. I talked to one other guy. But
Yeah,
he's a cool dude.
yeah. Mike's a
He's a really
wonderful
nice guy.
person, and his books wonderfully
I love
researched.
that one, and Psychonauts was
Yeah,
like,
and he's got a great writing style.
yeah,
It's just really engaging and makes me want to keep reading it.
yep. He gets really into all that stuff you're talking about, though, with like the ghost dance and how they banned
Yep.
it. And there was one American guy who was like, I forget. He was like very entrenched with like all of the Native American traditions, and then
It's pro-
Washington kind of blackballed him.
James James Mooney is
James
probably
Mooney,
it.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
he was actually banned from reservations at one point
from the U.S.
because
government from going
well, it was
there.
the missionaries who were
Oh,
involved with it had gone to Congress and were complaining about this ethnographer being there because they were trying to get people to give up their native religions. And Mooney was
he was trying to double
he
down.
was presenting it as these are legitimate, these
Yeah,
people have the right to their religion, and it's sort of almost perverse that we're in a country based on religious freedom where people who are supposedly about religious freedom are about religious freedom for themselves,
yeah.
but not for other people,
Not
sort
for
of
other
like what we're
people.
seeing with the so-called uh, free speech absolutists
Yeah,
that we see now actually really only respecting free speech they agree with
yeah,
and not liking free speech they don't agree with.
yeah. It's
And
always how that
so
ends
it
up.
yeah, but that's the problem when you have that sort of smoke and mirrors game
Yeah,
go on.
it's like
you
if you
know
like
is
free speech, you gotta like everything.
well, and this is the problem with free speech, is there is a line at which it ends, but the question is we don't all agree with what that line
Yeah,
is. There's areas where it's like, yeah, it's real obvious. You cannot walk into a crowded movie theater and yell fire
yeah,
because you'll be physically causing harm to panic people.
Yeah.
And but when you enter into areas where there is no actual physical harm, there's just offense taken. That's where it gets very much trickier because many people only respect free speech around offensive areas if it's them being offensive. But if they're
Yeah.
the ones being offended, then they don't recognize free speech being defensible.
Yeah. It's
And
complicated.
it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be,
It doesn't have
but
to be complicated at all. You know, it's people should in fact have the right to be offensive.
yeah.
Now, they don't have the right to be causing other people harm maliciously.
Yeah.
You know, and really that should be as complex as that line is.
Yeah. I'd agree. But I think the other question I had for you before I got to get back and make dinner for the kids. How did you get into bugs? Because my 6-year-old son saw your website and he was like, you got to ask him about these bugs. And he was
Oh,
like,
they're there. They're
yeah.
there.
It's
I mean,
like,
when I was a little kid, I was just fascinated by all sorts of, well,
oh, my
life and
son's,
period.
his
And so
bug stuff's through the roof.
yeah, so I would try to find everything I possibly could. And same thing growing up. You know, I was very, very interested in botany, biology, and the world of insects.
Yeah.
Um,
He
but
saw
when
that
I
on your website and was like, are you going to talk to this man about bugs? I was like, we'll
and
bring it
I
up. Don't worry, dude.
and the reason there's so many bugs on the website is because there's so many bugs where I live.
Yeah.
And so I was just trying to chronicle all of the different forms of life that's there, you know, be it plants or fungi or animals. And the world of insects are one of the easier ones to get
Yeah.
photographs of. Like there's massive amounts of birds and things like mountain lions and
Yeah.
bobcats, but
That's what he was talking about.
good luck snapping a photo of a mountain lion on site when I want one. You know,
He
it's
was
like that.
like, what was he telling me? He was like, oh, he's out in California. He must get a lot of interesting like amphibians and beetles. He's like, around here on the East Coast, we have more moths. So I could send him moth pictures. I was like, all right, I'll tell him.
Yeah, because that's the other one is we have a lot of cool amphibians there
Yeah.
too. And so I've
So
got
he
a
was,
pretty good selection of amphibians, a fair one of the reptiles, but you know, I can't, you know, snakes can be in particular can be really hard to photograph
yeah.
except for just lucky moments.
Yep. They're
You
hard
know,
to get.
but I'd love photos of everything possible if I could get it.
I'll tell him to
But
send
it's
he loves moths right now.
oh, very cool. Yeah,
So
and the fun thing is identifying them. And this is something that
yeah.
your son may need would like to know about because it's super powerful, which is something called Bug Guide. And I think it's bugguide.net. It might be bugguide.com, but just Bug Guide. And it's a project that's associated with the University of Iowa, which has a huge entomology program. And it's just like it's just species after species after species of
Oh, it's so
bug
cool.
photos. But where it's super potent is if you can't find your bug and you want to know what it is, you submit a photograph of it. And typically within 15 minutes of me uploading a photograph of an
They ID it.
unidentified bug, I got an email
Oh,
notification
you
saying
said it's
that somebody's bug guide. I think
bugguide.net or dot
it's
com.
either .net or .com, but just
I'll find it.
Google bug guide
Yeah.
and
I'll be over the moon.
their ability to identify not just insects, but you know millipedes, scorpions, centipedes. It's phenomenal
I'll
because
put him onto that when I get home. He'll be
it's like
very happy.
it's like cream of the crop entomologists are there, and sometimes the people like on one of the millipedes I had identified, it was like, you know, one of the people who'd done like a monograph on millipedes is the person who did the ID on it. And so it's actually accurate. It's not just, you know, community, you know, a community resource.
I'm
It's
fascinated to see what's gonna come of his young mind because, like, I remember being young and being really into stuff, but you hit a wall pretty quick. Like, your local library was the end of the road, or like
yeah.
someone you knew in the neighborhood that knew about it. But I'm like, what's gonna happen to a kid who's fascinated by this stuff with all of the knowledge in the world at his fingertips?
And he has that now,
That's what he
you know,
has. So I'm like, what does it? What becomes of this? Like,
you
it's
know, translation software in particular
yeah,
has really expanded things where a person can like copy and paste text out of a PDF, drop it into Google Translate, and be reading something that was published in Bulgarian.
It's crazy.
And it's yeah. So yeah, so
And even the
you
ability to like speak with people. Like I've been like I mean, like I said, I've been researching psychedelic drugs intently for about 5 years now. And like the ability to find information and then reach out to other people that know so much like you, it's so easy now. Whereas before, like you'd have to find addresses and letters. It's all like all the
yeah.
knowledge is coming together so well that
Well,
it's
that's very true. And it was happening before that through snail mail.
yeah.
I mean, it's so all of these things really, were continuing, but now it's escalating because it is so much quicker and easier.
And
And
it's like
that to me is exciting. I mean, we're literally standing on the cusp of a period of history that's going to either see great revolutions in what's possible or our demise.
yeah.
It just all depends on which direction people choose.
Well, I mean, it could. I sometimes think it could go in both directions. You know, like
It will to
it'll
some
be
degree.
here, and then you can go the other way too, because it's like with the advent of the internet comes like your ability to research and connect with people in levels we never saw fit. And it's also your ability to consume is something we couldn't even fathom 20 years ago.
Well, and it's compounded by a force in the opposite direction, which is that there's so much information available right now that it's difficult, sometimes impossible to process it just
Yeah.
because of the volume of it. I started putting together a bibliography on DOM as sort of a side product of the piece that I'd written and recently published on it. And at one point, I'm thinking, gosh, this might exceed 400 titles. And, and just sort of keep growing. Right now, it's at 2,088 titles. And
Whoa.
I've got about 69% of them annotated. But the problem with this is when this picture exists for every molecule and every subject, um, instead of having like a digestible volume of information accessible to us, now we have these almost undigestible volumes of
Yeah.
information. And so not only do you have the challenge of determining what's valid and what's worth processing, but you also have this problem of how much time do I have in my
Yeah, to
life
sift. It's
to
like
be
mining
to be
gold.
doing this?
It's true.
And
I,
and
I
so
look at it more for like reference points, like so
yeah,
with DOM, I'm studying DOM right now. So I'm able to be like, whereas people 15 years ago would have been like, I think they said something about 30 milligrams 3 times, like let's give it a
yeah,
shot. You would only remember. So now I'm able to be like, okay, I'll try 4. After reading all this information, 4 should be a way
but
to
if
test.
if you were to apply the same concern to, say, mescaline
Mm-hmm.
and want to create a bibliography on that molecule, you'd be looking at, I believe, in excess of 30,000 titles. Now, some of these are going to be books, not
Mm-hmm.
just articles. No one has the physical ability to sit down and adequately digest and process that volume of material.
Yeah.
It just can't happen. And so this is the downside of having this literally ocean of access for materials. It used to be that if I sat down to try to find 100 papers, I would only be able to get 30 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now I can typically get, 95 to 99 of them. And so it's wonderful,
Yeah.
except for the thing that we don't get is more time to
Yeah. To go
process
through it.
this. My life doesn't somehow get longer just because I have
Yeah.
more to study. I mean,
That's true. But it's a good and bad, especially with mescaline. Like, there's also no way to like wrap your brain around it fully. So like the papers will just keep coming. And
and
even like,
there's and new ones
yeah,
as of this year. I mean, it's like some marvelous work is occurring right now around mescaline, around peyote, and around San Pedro. Things like looking at distribution of alkaloids inside the plant. You know,
Yeah.
looking at the differential distributions, which is just a not just useful to some folks, but it's a fascinating thing to ponder of, thinking about questions like, why does this plant even contain mescaline?
Yeah.
What's the purpose of it?
Which is a whole nother like people say like it's to deter bugs, but the bugs love them.
Yeah. And so this is
The
the other
slugs,
thing is
caterpillars, they love the stuff.
we have this idea that, everything has to have a purpose, but the purpose that we think everything has to have is like a human purpose.
Yeah, it might not
And
exist in our
and I
space.
don't, yeah, I have
Like
no
who knows?
idea. They clearly are feeding deterrence, but if if that was the primary purpose for, say, mescaline existing, why isn't it more common?
Yeah. Why doesn't every plant have it?
It's just, and so I think, that's obviously a function it serves, but to say that's its purpose for being there, it would, I'm not necessarily buying that because it would seem like, the plant would have found a simpler but equally nasty tasting alkaloid.
Mm-hmm. Or like you said, it would be in several different plants.
Yep. And now there are things that very clearly do have feeding deterrent capabilities, like some of the toxic non-protein amino acids, like you find in what's it, Lucana, I think,
What's
maybe
that?
is the genus. Its a common name is guajillo. It's a Mexican plant, not the acacia in Texas, but this is one that's farther south in Mexico. And there's a number of plants that will do this, where when if say there's a plant that's browsed on by something or eaten by some herbivore, they'll contain these. It'll give what's essentially protease inhibitors. And so when the animal eats these protease inhibitors, it essentially creates a starvation condition in that animal by interfering with their ability to digest the food they've just eaten. And so it ends up in, like weight loss, poor health. And so any animal that focuses on eating these plants is going to have problems with reproduction and problems with
Oh
staying
wow.
alive in the long term. And so that's a true feeding deterrent.
Yeah.
Even though it might not make the animal stop eating it over time, it's going to make that
It'll
animal
work.
eat a whole lot less of it
Yeah.
and maybe have less viable kids. Some or offspring. I guess kids isn't the right word, but it's just, we tend to anthropomorphize things or see things based on human needs and
Hmm.
concerns. And this is one of the problems peyote runs into is it's a common to find a belief that its purpose is as a sacrament for humans. And I would say an application of it is as a sacrament for humans. But I don't believe that's peyote's purpose. I
Yeah.
believe peyote's purpose is its own. I believe the purpose that peyote has is to live, flower, drop seeds, and make more peyote.
Hmm.
And I
We just
believe
happen to be a
that's
footnote. Yeah.
and it just happens to have a something in it as an element that humans can find use for. But to say that we are its reason for being here
Yeah, it's
is
insane.
pretty arrogant,
Yeah.
but humans tend to be pretty
I
arrogant.
kind of like usually stay like with most of my psychedelic studies, I've kind of learned to like you're saying, just de-anthropomorphize all that stuff. And like the magical thinking is another thing. Like you want to assign so much to psychedelics, but you're like, I can't. Like it's not. It's like I think I read in your paper, Shulgin said like they're just different um, vocabularies.
Yeah.
So
Or
once
and
I
then
got into that mindset, I've found like my use of them is way more like grounded and like it's like I take them now and I'm like okay, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to sit down and like let this do its thing and try to almost shut my analytical mind off and be like
yeah,
what are we doing here? What's going to happen? And like kind of let it like, and I like what you said about learning to like shuffle those thoughts out but I'm gonna try that next time. Is to just because I've been more of the thing of like, why is it showing me this? Why is it showing me this? And like
That's
kind of
it's good to
fixating on it.
ask.
Well, like
It's
you're
good to
saying,
ask. But
sometimes
but
it's
if it
nonsense.
well, if it gets to a point where it's recurrent and you're not getting anything of value out of it, then it becomes nonsense.
Hmm.
But it's always good to ask the question, why is this being put in my face right now?
I do this thing on LSD. It always comes up. It's like there's like a handful of them, but one of them is I'll start fixating on like where single use mass productive or mass produced items go. For instance, like if a sports team wins the World Series and everywhere the city's awash with like Phillies World Series 1999, like the day that's over, where did all that stuff go? And I'm like, we do that as humans over and
Yep.
over. Like we'll make 10 billion eclipse glasses. I'm like, where does all this go? But like I'll like fixate on like a specific item that was made for one specific time and I'll like track it through my mind and be like, why have I been thinking about this for 2 hours? Like it's in a landfill.
And
It's like,
yeah, the things that, we get exposed to in those states can be really peculiar. I
yeah.
mean, I once, this is like many years ago now, but I'd had a chance to try 40 milligrams of TMA2. And that
Okay.
was sort of interesting. It's not as I prefer mescaline. But where it was sort of odd is in the latter stages of it, I was experiencing these like full on like dream sequences. And in one of them, I remember I was thinking about how so many of the food products and things that we get exposed to are made out of like pastes that then get extruded and formed into various products. And I was pondering the fact that, some of, there's carcinogenic molecules in some of these and problematic materials in some that actually cause health problems with people. But because there's so much diversification between food companies and pharmaceutical companies, you could actually be given a cancer or some sort of other health problem by the same company that was responsible for making the chemotherapy medications that healed you from that problem.
Yeah.
And if you shopped well enough, you might even be able to be made ill, cured, and be buried all within the confines of one
Of
single
one company.
parent company. And and so as I was thinking, as these thoughts were going through my head, I'm seeing this thing that I'm identifying. I've never seen RJ Reynolds corporate headquarters, so I have no
Hmm.
idea, but there's this like glass fronted room that I'm seeing in my mind or envisioning in my mind as RJ Reynolds' corporate office. And a man walks into the door, pulls out a handgun, and says, "You've killed me." And he puts the gun to his head and commits suicide. And then behind him, there's another person walking up, saying the same thing, committing suicide. Pretty soon, there's like a pile of bodies, like piling up in the lobby of the tobacco company's home office. And then I'm seeing this is like happening as this thing worldwide, where all these people are going out and committing suicide in the lobbies of the companies who had given them cancer or some other industrial disease.
Damn.
And I'm thinking, this is a really weird thing. This is just like not normally where I go
Yeah.
when I'm altered. The next day, it was the Seoul Olympics. And there was a farmer who basically got up in front of everybody and said, "You're killing me," and committed suicide in front
Wow.
of everyone. And I was just thinking, wow, this is like a very weird and tidy little meme to be wrapped together with what I just experienced last
That's
night.
insane.
And so it's there's some of these I can't call them connections
Like
because I can't see the
synchronicities, I
connection, but
guess.
synchronicities that
Yeah. I've gotten that
um
too, where like,
it, it's intriguing stuff. But it really makes me feel like everything has a lot more interconnectedness than
yeah.
is apparent to us, and more than we can wrap our brains around and hold all at one time. Because we're really finite in
Mhm.
terms of I used to like to think I had an infinite capacity for memory. But as I've been going through like the Shulgin archive, before I was all the way through with the file cabinets, it became clear to me I could not accurately remember what I had scanned like 5 file cabinets before. And that was sort of humbling because prior to that, I thought, my ability to remember things was infinite or
Yeah,
had an infinite capacity. And I've definitely had some corrections made on
that's
that
funny.
mistaken
Yeah,
notion.
your brain eventually will hit a wall.
It
I
does, because
learned
we
that
can,
years ago. I used to own a restaurant, and I like took pride in the fact that I knew everybody's name that ordered food. And then I swear one day I like the bottle broke, and I was just like, I can't remember your fucking name. Then after that, I was like panic mode, and I swear they like all got jumbled up, and I couldn't do it anymore. But it was
yep,
like, I think I hit like a critical mass of names new in my head. It was just like, I don't know any.
yep, that's
So,
exactly what happened with me as I hit this critical mass and then it just all deflated.
yep. You're like, now you don't really start over. Like you just emptied the vessel. So that's cool. But I got to get back and make dinner for those guys.
Well, hey,
But
fun talking
Keeper,
with,
I
yeah,
really
fun
like talking
talking
to you.
with
I'm
you.
glad I got to finally talk to you. And I'm definitely going to order one of your books.
Oh,
Because
cool.
I'm telling you, every
Yeah.
day I have like a couple extra $100. Not every day, but a lot of times I have a couple extra $100. And I'm like, oh, I might just order this on Amazon or on eBay or whatever.
Okay, well, I'll drop information in an email to you as
Cool,
soon
cool.
as
And I'll
we're
put
off
it out.
here. And then just whenever you get to it, great.
Oh, awesome.
Uh,
Thank you
but
so much for talking to
thanks
me.
for your interest. And if you have any more questions at any point, I'm always happy to attempt to answer them or to say I don't know
Oh,
when that's the
I'll get you
reality.
some moth picks too.
Oh, cool, cool.
All right, Keeper.
Okay, hey,
Thank you so much.
thanks.
I'll see
Have a
you.
great, yep, take care.